All right, hey everyone, welcome to this session. It's right at 8:30, so I guess we'll go ahead and start right now. I'm always worried about going over time, so I'm going to start right as soon as we can. Welcome to this session, Intro to OpenTelemetry for Developers. If some of you are trying to get that QR code, it's okay. It's over here on the next slide. It'll also be right at the end. So that QR code will go ahead and take you to a page on my site, which has two buttons on there. One button is if you want to go ahead and view these slides again. You can go ahead and view them. They're self-hosted on the site, so you'll see them exactly how they're shown right here. The other button on there is a link to GitHub if you want to go ahead and download any of the demo code that I'm going to be showing later today as part of this session. So you can go ahead and download all of that later. Also, just kind of a heads up, I was told that there's a bit of an echo in here, so just, I guess, be careful with like certain loud noises or something. I hope it doesn't mess with the recording or anything, but just letting you know. And I guess that'll probably end up affecting the other sessions too. I'm not sure. Let's see. I'm also told people like it when I give some sort of about me. So I'm Al Rodriguez, developer for a while. I've tried to take the name programmer Al online at a bunch of places. I generally use Blue Sky and LinkedIn. I do have to capitalize the two letters in my name. Otherwise, people call me AI because the I looks a lot like a lowercase l. That's happened as recently as a week ago. So it's a continuing problem. It's something that I don't think I'll be able to escape. So. All right, all that stuff out of the way, let's actually talk about this session, the reason you're here, right? The stuff you actually care about. Whoops, sorry about that. Just want to give you a heads up. Here's the general guide about what we're going to talk about. First, we're going to talk about observability, and then how that leads into OpenTelemetry as a technology, right? Observability is the concept. It's the thing that we actually want in our applications. OpenTelemetry is the technology we use to help get that, right? And then we're going to go ahead and look at more of OpenTelemetry with some demo code and that kind of stuff. When I do show the demo code, it is all C# .NET stuff, but conceptually it works across basically every programming language that you use. So you don't have to be a .NET person, using the code, just like I'm going to be showing. All right. So why observability, right? Let's go ahead and talk about what the purposes are for observability and why we would care about it. So within an organization, we kind of have different jobs, different roles, and as a result, different things that we care about. And observability within an application is kind of supposed to help us across all of those, right? So as developers, we kind of care about the runtime information because we care about bugs, right? We want to be able to diagnose any issues at runtime that will happen or have happened, that kind of stuff, right? Shifting gears to a different role within the company, you also have the IT side, right? The operations, SRE, whatever you want to call it. These are the people who are caring about the application as it runs. They want to know, hey, is the application currently healthy? Is it experiencing more issues than normal, right? Is there anything that they need to do at that point in time to fix anything, right? And then third, which is important, but we kind of ignore it, I think, more often than we should as developers, is anyone on the business side, right? Project managers, et cetera. They want to know about the application because they care about the future, right? They're planning features or things that we should work on, all that kind of stuff. And they need to know about the current state or the history of the application as it's running to figure out, hey, are there certain things that we can glean off of how this is being used by our customers? Are there certain things that are extra slow that maybe we should prioritize? Stuff like that, right? Like that's the purpose of observability for that side of people. So as an organization, everyone cares about having observability within the application. We just have the different parts that we care about. So let's take a little bit of a history lesson, I guess, right? I like to do some level setting. So way back in 1957, that is the year Fortran was created. If you wanted to get any insights into your application, you were probably writing plain text messages. I'm assuming this. I didn't really look into it, other than the year Fortran was created. right? You probably weren't logging to a file. Disk space was very expensive back then, but if you needed to figure out what was going on at the time, I assume they would write out to, there was a buffer, there was a screen. You fast forward to today, and it is very common to basically be doing the same thing, right? We have way more programming languages, which is cool. But if you want to know what's going on with your application, it's very common to still write a plain text message to a log, the console screen, or you're just sending that off to some third-party vendor, right? The big difference is that now those log messages are just way more verbose. You can kind of see in the image right there. We've got a date time stamp. You have the level, right? That's an info message. You have a whole string. There's a JSON object embedded in that string that needs to get parsed, right? And so I'm assuming that the reason that this was all put out that way was because, well, that message then gets shipped off to a vendor, and then you have to write some custom query if you want to figure out what's going on with that, right? Some of those vendors can query that JSON embedded in that string. Some aren't, great at that, but that's still a thing that it's an option, and you pay for it too, right? As a company, a lot of these third-party vendors get very expensive because of features like that, because there's just so much string parsing going on. And so I don't like picking on a technology, but unfortunately there are a lot of limitations to things like plain text logging, right? So one is, that I've kind of already touched on, is data in files, right? It's kind of hard to sift through, right? We were talking about that JSON string in there, and if you want to run a query for hey, how many times has something been purchased with this number, right? If you're only writing that output to a log file, then that's hard to parse, right? Another thing is it's hard to combine logs for a distributed application. I'm pretty sure the majority, if not every person in this room who works on an application is working on a distributed application, right? You probably have a UI somewhere that talks to a backend service, and then how many things does that backend service talk to, right? 4, 5, 20, no idea. But distributed applications, very common, hard to debug if you're just looking at log files. Now, third-party vendors do make that a lot easier, thankfully, right? That does make things easier for us. It's easier to search through those logs and that kind of stuff. And they do have some stuff in there to kind of help diagnosing across distributed applications, but you still hit some limitations with that because of plain text logging. So I want you to think about this scenario, and I've kind of already touched on it, but just think of a scenario where you have a UI that's going to go ahead and make an HTTP request, and it's going to call service A, which then calls service B, and then it calls service C. And then service C is going to return some data that's not as expected, and so as a result, service B, right in the center, that's going to go ahead and throw an exception. And so now you as a developer have to figure out what went wrong, right? So first you have to figure out, where was the exception thrown? And you could probably figure that out pretty easily. But then you have to figure out why exactly was it thrown, right? What was the data? Is B wrong? Should B have been less strict on those rules? Is C wrong? Should it have been more strict on its rules in terms of what it sent back, right? Are there changes that have to happen in all the, at any point in the stack? So just imagine, how do you diagnose that, right, across these multiple applications? Or hey, maybe service A was the problem. It didn't validate input from the UI as it should have, right? Because that's not even listed in the where the exception could have happened, right? So a lot of things that we have to think about for distributed applications are just hard to think about sometimes. All right. So really quickly, I have not talked yet about OpenTelemetry. We've just been talking so far about observability concepts. Now, before we talk about OpenTelemetry, I just want to pick on one of the proprietary vendor APIs out there. I'm going to talk about Azure Application Insights because it's the one that I know the best, and that's it. All of the third-party vendors, they kind of have their own SDK, and they're all pretty similar to this kind of thing. So I just want to call out the basics of an SDK like this. So with Azure Application Insights, and basically every other vendor, you can upload logs, right? That's the simple thing. That's kind of like the base level. If you're not able to upload logs, then I don't know what it's for, right? That's kind of the default. You can also upload certain metrics, and that's a lot less of us on developers, right? It's usually just going to hook into other stuff within the operating system, whatever, right? You know, requests per second, trends, the stuff that people like to see on charts. And then the last thing is that you can actually go ahead and write custom code to add, you know, custom regions or things like that. So you can like wrap a method call and say, hey, this one's important and I want to add some information to it. And that one's cool, and that is, unfortunately, used a lot less often. But that one, we'll see in a minute, that's actually a big part of OpenTelemetry, or at least that's my favorite part of it, at least. So now, here we go. 10 minutes in the presentation, now let's talk about OpenTelemetry, right? So what it is, why we care about it, why it's so cool, et cetera, et cetera. Here's all like the standard things you can kind of see online, right? It is an open standard for collecting telemetry data about distributed services. Cool, I've kind of already mentioned that already. Open source, vendor neutral, language agnostic, and it has separate APIs and SDKs. If you want to read, you know, the standard text about that, there's the website, OpenTelemetry.io. It's very useful, actually, if you want to go ahead and get started using OpenTelemetry after this. That is a very useful website for getting started. I used it a ton when I was first learning, and I still find myself going back there for, you know, some reference information here and there. I want to be really clear. OpenTelemetry is not logging. It is a different technology. There are some ways to go ahead and use logging with OpenTelemetry. Now, we don't really have the time to talk about that today, but I want to be clear that as far as, you know, writing plain text log messages somewhere, as a technology, it's very different. You can have an application that has no logging. It's a little difficult to do that because a lot of things that we pull into our applications these days, just by default, they will write out logs to somewhere. But for the most part, you know, unfortunately, OpenTelemetry is a different thing. And the reason I'm calling this out is because if you want to go ahead and start using this with an application that already exists, it's going to be some work to go ahead and start using OpenTelemetry, right, to add to it. If you're going to start an entirely new application, you can go ahead and use one or both, right? You don't have to just use one of them. But I just wanted to call that out and say it is a different thing. All right, so what kind of stuff does OpenTelemetry care about, right? Like, what are we going to get in terms of observability by using this technology? So OpenTelemetry has like two primitives. Traces, which are the, you know, full lifespan of a request. So HTTP request comes into your application, and, you know, that's going to hit service A, and then you're going to go to service B and C, right? That example we talked about earlier. So a trace is that whole thing, the entire lifespan of that. So just by default, it's built with that understanding that, hey, we have distributed applications. Also, because this is more of a development talk, this is the thing we're going to talk a lot more about. Because this is, as developers, we're going to interact with this a lot more. The other thing that OpenTelemetry cares about are metrics. And so these are the numbers, these are like the things that go on charts, all of that kind of stuff. We're going to talk very little bit about that, really just right here and on slide number 2 right here. So the thing about metrics is that, like I mentioned, as developers, we don't interact with them as much, right? Within our operating system, there's a lot of stuff that just kind of is tracked for us, right? Memory usage, CPU usage, stuff like that. Other metrics show up from just kind of installing an agent. Maybe you have like a container sidecar or something like that, but something else is usually just kind of injecting into our process and like grabbing that info, right? Request per second being one of them, stuff like that. You can write your own metrics, your own collector, and then that can go ahead and send info, but it's not something that really ends up inside of our application, not often at least. So that's why I'm not really going to talk too much about metrics. The thing we care about as developers usually is traces, because that's the thing that we put into our application. That's the custom code that we'll end up writing, right? Similar to logs, right? We write log messages out so that way we can view that information a little bit later. So like I mentioned, a trace in OpenTelemetry, that is the full lifespan of that request. if you want to see like a kind of little simple example of what that looks like. So you can kind of see right here, what we have is just kind of like that traditional trace where you can say, hey, we have a request that started over here in users/create purchase, right? This is some endpoint users gonna create some purchase. Notice the service name over here. It's in the user service. And then at some point, we're making this HTTP post, and that goes to a different service right over here, right? So just by default, the way the SDK works is it's able to go ahead and just kind of start tracking, which application you're in. And the way that works is each application kind of has to say, what its service name is. There's a little bit of stuff you have to do when you initialize, right? When on startup, just kind of to set a few properties. But other than that, thankfully, a lot of that information is taken care of for us. And a lot of the way that these SDKs work is that there's a lot of default information that it'll go ahead and grab, but there's a lot that we can go ahead and add to it. So let's see. Whoop. Sorry, hit the wrong button there. All right, let me show you a better example. Whoops, not this slide. Sorry, I'll show you a better example in another slide. But one thing that I want to call out about traces is that traces are made up of spans. And so an individual span is like, hey, this is the region. This is a thing that we want to go ahead and care about. And if I take a step back over here just to look at the previous slide, you see how we've got 4 lines over there? Each line is a span. That's basically it. We say a trace is the whole thing, but when we interact with this, if we're going to write code to track, to to observe some certain section of our code, we're going to create a span and just add some information to that. So moving back over here, so traces have spans, and then spans also have a bunch of key value pairs. And that's just the data that we're going to go ahead and store. So if you want to think, how do I compare this to logging, how I normally observe that way? Well, if you're going to log out a full sentence, you're usually saying like, hey, the ID is this, and request code is blah, 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 right? So instead of writing that out as a sentence, it's just a bunch of key value pairs. Simple thing, just a little bit more common than how we work, right? Because normally when we're writing code, we're not writing, hey, here's a string. We're just calling methods, and we're saying, hey, here's some inputs. Same thing with, with spans. So the other thing that I want to call out about OpenTelemetry, you're probably wondering, hey, how exactly does it actually track the trace, all the way across, right? So there's a part of the standard, part of OpenTelemetry standard is called the trace parent header. And this is just a unique ID of the trace itself. So every trace gets a unique ID, and it's just going to make sure that it goes, that it gets passed along. So by default, like all the SDKs are just going to go ahead and include that for you. If it has it, it'll get included. If it doesn't have it, then it can go ahead and create a new one for you. And so just kind of looking at this over here, you can kind of see what a trace parent looks like right there. It's right here. I don't know how well you can see it. You don't need to see it really. It's just text. That's all it is. So service A is going to call service B, and I'm sorry, that's a typo. That should be service B. That's my mistake. I should fix that. But then you're going to go over here. It's going to make a new request. Maybe it's going to put a message into the queue, and you can go ahead and include the trace parent there. One thing to note, depending on which SDK you have, it might not know how to put how to inject that trace parent header ID into like a JSON message that goes into a queue. So you might have to write some custom code for that. And that's something that I've had to do in the past, where you put a message in there and you're saying, okay, well, whenever I put a message into my queue, I'm just going to go ahead and add a custom property to this JSON object. It's going to be the header. And then when something pulls off of that queue, well, you're going to have some custom code that grabs that. But then now you have the trace header, that parent ID, and you can go ahead and then just say, okay, well, cool. Now that I have this ID, I am part of this trace. I'm just going to include that info with everything that I have. And so that makes it very easy for you to then just say, okay, well, the rest of this completely separate service over here that's just running off of a queue, that's able to include its information as part of the request, or sorry, as part of the trace, the entire lifespan of the trace. So if you have, the common example, right, is you have an order that comes in, and then by default, you just put a message onto a queue, and then you immediately respond like, cool, we took your message, awesome. We're going to go ahead and process that over time. And so that processing over time means that now your message goes into a queue, and then maybe you have the something else send a message onto like a queue that says, hey, we need to send an email, and then another queue that says, hey, we need to actually like do the physical work of doing the order stuff, right? And maybe another queue for something else. I don't know what, right? But that way you're able to actually track all of that information from start to finish. So that's all just based off of that ID. And if you've ever played with other SDKs, you're probably familiar with this concept, right? It's just an ID that's passed along. I was making fun of the Azure, or not really making fun of it. I was talking about the Azure Application Insights SDK earlier. Same thing, Azure does something like that. I know all the others do too. I just don't know the name of those. So let's kind of go ahead and move on. Here's an example of a trace of like the things that you can do, the things that it does for you. So HTTP request comes into your system, a trace is created. Trace doesn't already exist yet, so it's going to say, okay, cool, well, you're not giving me an ID, so I'm going to make a new one. This is the start of a new trace. Cool. Now, by default, their OpenTelemetry SDK, if you're going to go ahead and make another HTTP request out to something, by default, it's able to go ahead and just inject in there and include the trace header. This does depend on the language, I believe. I'm not sure if all of them make that easy. But I think most of them do. I can't speak for every language. And then by default, also that SDK is going to add some default information too, right? Like what's the response, the HTTP response code, what's the URL you sent that to. I'll show you some examples of this a little bit later when we get to the demo code. But it has some information it can just go ahead and grab for you, which is always cool. The SDK can also know about other things too, right? Like not just the HTTP requests, but things like making a database call. Same concept. And then separately, you can also add custom code if you want to make a custom span and just say, hey, this is a special thing. I want to keep track of some extra information right here to help me diagnose or observe certain things later on. And so we'll be seeing some examples of pretty much all this stuff pretty soon. And then the last thing that I want to mention is that OpenTelemetry, as far as the SDK goes, it's very dependent on using environment variables for things like where to send its data to and all that kind of stuff. So I'll show you a quick example of what I mean by that. But the reason that I want to call this out is for the purposes of deployment. So when I run this locally on my machine, I'm going to be sending OpenTelemetry data locally to my machine. And so that's all going to be set by an environment variable. And then if I want to go ahead and send this out to some other service, I just have to go ahead and change that variable. The only reason I'm not going to be showing that today, we don't have an internet connection, but usually I like to just kind of show like, hey, I just want to change this and start sending it somewhere else. So let's go ahead and look at some actual code and play around with that. So, all right, over here on in Visual Studio, so I just have a simple application. This is going to be running in Aspire. I don't know how many people here are familiar with .NET Aspire. If you're a .NET developer and you're not familiar with it, it's a really cool thing. There are, I think, at least 2 other sessions here at Stir Trek talking about it, so definitely give it a look. But one of the reasons that I'm calling this out about using .NET Aspire is, and an unfortunate thing about OpenTelemetry is that it's not something you can easily view. So, when comparing this to something like logging, right, those are plain text messages meant for humans to read. So it's easy for us to just read a sentence, right? OpenTelemetry sends all of its data as a protobuf message. I don't know how many people here are familiar with Google Protobuf, Protocol Buffer, I think is the full name. It's just a binary serialization encoding. That just means it's binary, right? We don't read that. We're humans. We don't read the ones and zeros or what, the bytes that it's sending, right? So as a result, it becomes a little bit harder to view that information from OpenTelemetry. So you need another application to receive that information. So thankfully, .NET Aspire has made that a lot easier on the .NET world. If you're not a .NET person, you can use like Grafana or something like that running in a container locally on your machine, and you could just send the data there, and then you could see all your messages. All right, so Let's zoom out. Let me actually go ahead and run this. I did forget to hit that start running ahead of time, so this is going to be a little bit slower than I had planned. But hey, let's go ahead. I'm going to click on the internal API, and I'm going to go to the create product endpoint. And here, let me zoom in just a little bit. We're in a theater, so I guess first product is got to be popcorn, and it's very expensive these days, so I'm assuming somewhere around that price. Let's make another one, and we'll soda. That's usually less, so let's call that one 48. There we go. All right, cool. So these have both succeeded. Yep, 200. So we're going to go back over here, and I'm going to click on the internal API, and let's view the details. Oh, no. Did that change? No. All right. OK, I'll just click on the traces over here on the left. Sorry, I don't use this as much as I thought, and then sometimes they'll change things. This is what I get for updating stuff not too long before a demo. So that's all my problem. All right, so you can see this is the list of traces. So there have been 5 requests into our system. The bottom 2 right there are the ones we care about. There's 3 others. You're probably wondering, like, hey, what are those? You know, our application starts up. Something needs to kind of interrogate the system. I believe in this case, it's Aspire saying, like, hey, doing service discovery, right? So this is tracking all of our traces. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this bottom trace over here. Whoops. And you can see, hey, here's the full lifespan of that one individual trace that came in. You can see, hey, we have a post, create product. I have, this is a custom span right here, create product entity. We'll look at that code in a second. And then I did make a call to a database. So we have some extra info there for the database. So zooming out just a little bit. Let me click on this first one, and you can kind of see some of those properties over here that, as I was talking about, right? Traces have spans, and spans have attributes. These are all of those attributes, those key value pairs of things that we care about. So all of this that you're seeing right here, this is all the stuff the SDK just grabbed by default, right? Hey, here's the route that was called. Here's you know, the HTTPS, et cetera, right? All of that default info. The service name, all of that. Zooming out, I can go ahead and click on the database. And again, same thing similar with when we're making a database call, but I do want to call out, oops, oh, sorry. I hit the wrong button. That was my fault. All righty. I do want to call out this one, the my.db.statement. So I added some custom code to say, hey, I want to go ahead and include the database statement. So in my solution, I'm using an ORM, I'm using Entity Framework. And because of that, because I'm not writing the actual SQL, I think, hey, maybe it might be useful to go ahead and include the generated SQL statement in the span, right? Maybe it's not useful, it depends on your use case, right? But I think for my use case, yeah, why not? I'll go ahead and include that. So I added that generated SQL statement to the span so that later, if I need to diagnose something, I can do that. Now, this one doesn't have the actual data, right? This is just like the generated SQL statement. So I think if I actually click on it, let's see, can I highlight it? Yeah, there we go. Right, so I'm choosing not to include the actual parameters of what's being called. But that is something that I can go ahead and include with that info. So that's traces, right? And if I was to go ahead and take a step back, and let's go back to the public API. So here's a different API, and I'm just going to click the get all products, try it out, we'll execute. Let's give that a second. That's taking some time. It's loading. That's a little weird, right? We'll look into that in a second. But hey, we got our 200 response. We got our 2 products, cool, our very expensive popcorn and soda. Awesome. Let's go back to our traces over here. And we'll click on the newest one, this one on the bottom. And there we go. So we can see exactly what we had expected, right? We started in our public API over here. Then it ended up making a call eventually to the internal API. So here's our distributed application, which then ends up talking directly to our database. And we have a full lifespan over here of how long this took. And that one's a little weird. That's what is it, 3.2 seconds in total? Like, this is an application that's been running for a while. We should probably look into that. We'll get into that in a second. But now let's actually look at the code. Like, what do we have to do to be able to set up this code, something like this? So it's pretty simple. Like I said, conceptually, even though I'm showing all of this in C#, conceptually this all works across different languages. So I'm going to go directly to my public API service, and oops, I need to click on the correct file. So I have a line over here for configuring OpenTelemetry, and let's go ahead and look at that. F12, here we go. So zooming in, we're setting up OpenTelemetry, and the important part is, oh hey, we're telling it to grab some metrics. We can look at those metrics in a second, but it's just charts. It's just, you know, the stuff we don't care about, right? That's on the IT side. So over here, we're setting up our tracing, and within our code, we're saying, hey, add instrumentation for a couple of things. So add the ASP.NET stuff, add SQL, add HTTP. We have something commented out. That's just some of the default stuff that I chose not to delete. But all of these, what we're doing is we're saying, hey, within our SDK, we're using different components that are able to emit some amount of telemetry. And we're opting in. We're saying, cool, I want to include that stuff in my OpenTelemetry that I actually keep track of. So what if all of a sudden I say, hey, you know, I just don't want to keep track of the SQL stuff, right? The SQL client it's still going to talk to the database, but if I just, for some reason, choose I don't want to, I just comment out this line, or delete the line, right? I just get rid of it, and now that information doesn't get pushed. Like, it's still generated by the code. The client is still going to make that information. It's just not included in what gets pushed out. And then down here, we have this for each loop for adding our custom sources. So this is what we're going to go ahead and use when we want to add our own custom telemetry. So taking kind of a step back from that, so this is the public API. Let's look at the internal API. This one's going to do a little bit more. And so when I call my configure OpenTelemetry, I have a line here where I'm passing in a constant. Let me go ahead and look at that constant over here. This is the activity sources, so it's going to be sorry, I'm hitting the wrong keys on my keyboard. So we're going to grab internal API-source .star. So that .star is kind of the, you know, it's the wild card, right? You've recognized that from something. So we're going to say, hey, any traces using internal-API-source .whatever, I want to go ahead and include that. That's something that I am opting into, and whatever trace telemetry information that I want to make sure gets included in my stuff. And so one step down from that, I'm starting another one called internal API source .root. And so I don't know if you've noticed that, but that is the root span, or the root ID of what we're using over here in some of the stuff. And actually, if I go ahead and click on probably this one, internal API, let's see. This is what I get for going off script. Oh no. All right, I will see that in a second. We'll get to that spot. Anyway, so we're specifying, hey, that's our root. And then just kind of scrolling down a little bit below, I do want to mention where we're actually creating something within our code to say, hey, cool, so we already said, hey, anything with that internal API .star we want to include. Now let's actually make something that can generate that telemetry. And so that's what these two lines are below. We're going to go ahead and create a new tracer provider, and again, this is from the SDK, so whatever language you use might be a little bit different. But then we're going to go ahead and get a tracer that emits information using our custom activity source. And this is that one that is that, you know, internal API-root, right? I can go ahead and go to definition, and that's this line right here. App activity source is internal API-root. Oops, I have to move my mouse. Sorry about that one. So that's how we link it, right? So first, we have to register. We have to hook into the different OpenTelemetry sources. And then we have to, if we want to add our own stuff, our own custom stuff, we just have to register that, and then we can go ahead and start using that. So an example of using this, right, this tracer that we've created right here, the tracer being the SDK object that we use to go ahead and emit that information. If we want to go ahead and start using that, we just start using it. So let's go to this controller, to this endpoint, and we have one called get all products. So this one's going to be pretty simple. This is just the endpoint that we use internally to get all of our products. Notice that when we were over here, when we called our public API, get enabled products, that just called the get all products, or sorry, oh, that calls the get enabled. Whoops. All right, well then let's actually look at the get enabled products. we'll look at the correct endpoint. Sorry about that. This is what happens when you use a general API for multiple presentations. You forget some of those endpoints. All right, so down here, let's actually look at this code for the get all products, and that is this method right here. Let's zoom in. So here we have a tracer, and then this is what we were talking about earlier. And we're going to go ahead and start a span. So the name of that span is going to be query all products, just because we want to give it a name, right? As humans, we're going to be looking at this stuff a little bit later. So let's give a name to this thing that we're going to go ahead and start using. And oh, hey, look at that. There's that 3-second thing. I could never really figure out a good way to show the demo for that. But hey, cool. We noticed that in our query all products over here, it's taking 3 seconds. And hey, look, woo. We figured that out, yay. All right, no one's clapping. That's fine, you don't have to. I didn't think you would. So then we're also gonna go ahead and set an attribute, right? So this attribute, this is some information, my.product-count, and let's go ahead and just track that information, right? Again, traces have spans, which we created up there at the top, and then spans have properties, right? So here's that count. So we can actually go ahead and look at that count, and that's gonna be in this query all products, and hey, look at that, my.product-count, that's 2. So that's us, that's how we write that code to go ahead and get this information. So one of the things that I'm unfortunately not able to show off is how much easier it is to query this information, right? Unfortunately, I don't have the internet connection, so normally I would like to send some of this information on up to like a vendor and just start querying for this stuff. So different vendors make it easier or harder depending on their tooling to go ahead and query your information. And so if I wanted to say like, hey, I want to run a query where the my.product-count is greater than 10 or something, right? You think of whatever you want to think of. If we were comparing this to something like log messages, that would be difficult or impossible, right? Depending on your vendor, right? Some of them are just looking at logs. Some of them have that mix of things and how well they work. But if everything is in a key value pair, then by default, that makes writing those queries a lot easier. So just something to keep in mind for how you start writing out your information that goes into OpenTelemetry as far as those spans and everything. Okay. All right, so that is essentially that. I did mention really quickly that I wanted to show you, sorry, the environment variables that runs everything. So I just have a quick endpoint over here that's going to go ahead and return the list of environment variables. And I just want to call out a few things. So this endpoint right here, this OTel exporter endpoint, this means that this is pushing all of that OpenTelemetry data locally to my machine, right? Like I said, I have .NET Aspire running. That is just so that way we can go ahead and actually be able to view that information, right? Because like I said, it is a binary format. It's not a thing that we as humans are going to be able to read, so you do need to push that to something. And then by default, Aspire is also setting a bunch of other variables. We don't really care about those, too much internally, that kind of stuff. All right. So back to slides over here. We only have a few more slides. Going to make sure that we leave some time for questions. So the next thing that I just want to call out is there is something called an OpenTelemetry collector agent. And this is something that really confused me at the beginning when I started. Because when I started using OpenTelemetry, and since I've been using other SDKs in the past in my career, I always just sent the data directly out to the vendor, right? Like, hey, we have some logs. I'm going to use their SDK. It'll just go ahead and send that information. Well, the thing about OpenTelemetry is, well, once it gets that data, it sends it. So where's it going to send it to? So when you have a vendor, receiving your information, you're charged based on usage, right? How many requests you make and how much data you send over time. And they kind of charge you a little bit differently, right? Like if you send 1,000 requests in a minute or 1 request in a minute, but with the same amount of data, you're charged, a little bit differently, right? Because you're making more requests to their system. So the purpose behind the collector agent is, like, let's say you have your set of requests, or sorry, your set of services running somewhere within your environment, and you say, cool, we're going to have all of our services send the data to this one agent, and then this thing is going to receive it. It's going to batch all of that information that it then sends on to your vendor. And it could also do things like retries, right? Like what happens if the vendor goes down for a second, or maybe they say, hey, you've sent too many requests to us, so why don't you back off, right? That's the purpose of the agent. This is an open source application you can kind of go ahead and run. Some cloud companies now are just kind of including that in for you. One of Azure's services, I know, just kind of has that thrown in, so that way you can go ahead and just make it easier to send that on. So I just want to call it out as something to think about when you're thinking about, when you're sending your information on to a vendor, just because it's something that I completely missed when I first started. Basically, this is the last slide of information. I do want to call out, the entire time I was talking about OpenTelemetry, I was talking about it from the perspective of the backend, right? Requests come into your system, and then they go to other backend services and that kind of stuff, right? OpenTelemetry for the UI does exist. Personally, I think is a little bit harder to think about just from the perspective of when do you start that trace, right? Because you can just create that trace ID whenever you want and then just start passing it along with any requests. But do you start it when the page first loads? Do you start it when you're going to do something special, like someone adds something to their cart, right? So like it's just harder, I think, from that perspective. So something to think about if you want to include OpenTelemetry in the UI. All right, and this is it. So in conclusion, everyone at the company cares about observability, and OpenTelemetry as a technology is something that makes that a little bit easier, right? I don't think I really drove home how much easier it is to go from those spans and attributes, querying that information to what the PMs care. But it's that kind of thing that makes answering their questions kind of a lot easier. And then lastly, traces have spans, have attributes. So that QR code, again, is the same one as the beginning. That one goes to my site, which has those buttons if you want to view these slides again or view that demo code. That's all online. And then lastly, I forgot to include this on the slides, but if you have any questions or anything like that, we do have a few minutes for questions. But also, there is the Discord group. If you have not joined the Discord group for StirTrek here, just go to the schedule. There's a link right at the top. There are channels for all of the sessions. I will be looking at the OpenTelemetry one. So if you have any extra questions, if we don't have time to answer your question, I will go ahead and be able to try to answer it there at least. Yep. Okay, and that's it. Thanks. All right, thanks. Oh, what kind of latency does this introduce? So not more than if you're sending logging, right? Because you still need to trace something, right? It ends up, in my mind, like I've never really measured it. My assumption is it's going to be a lot less because you're sending a lot less information, right? When you're sending a string of information, that's going to be more than the tiny binary serialized version. Especially if you're going to use the OpenTelemetry collector agent, because then you're just going to be sending that data locally to something within your system, right? Like on the same network at least. And then that's the thing really sending that information out to your vendor. So in my mind, this actually ends up being a little bit faster from that perspective. And as a result, cheaper too. Yep.
If an exception gets thrown, will the trace still log?
So the question was, if an exception is thrown, will the trace still log? Basically, no. Like by default, no, right? Because it's just like code. You still have to have that catch somewhere. So if you have like a middleware or something in there that does do that catch, like in .NET, I'll usually add some middleware that's just my try catch. And then I can add some more information to it, right? Usually, if you're going to log, you log some more messages, or OpenTelemetry, there's a method call called like .set exception or something like that. I forget what it is. But it'll go ahead and grab exception details to include in your traces. Mm-hmm. Yep. All right, cool. I don't see any more hands. So like I said, I'll be around all day, and I'll also be checking that Discord, so if you have any questions. Also, that QR code has links to my social stuff, so if you want to ask me a bug, or just hurl what any insults you want to, feel free. It's okay. So thanks.